Welcome back. So obviously I know Bérengère. We're actually chatting about how we haven't seen each other for probably more than 7 years. We met as undergrad in Lyon, both doing biology, obviously, but she continued doing neuroscience. Well, obviously I went in microbiology. She earned obviously Master of Science in neuroscience, working on memory deficit associated with neurodegenerative diseases, and she's now in Edinburgh working on autism and bilingualism. So that's what she'll be talking about today. So if you've not been here before, I remind you that if you have any questions, just put them in the chat while Bérengère is talking, and we'll just address them at the end of the talk. Sorry. Okay, so I see that she's shared this card already, so you can just go.
Cool. So it's working. You can all see my screen, my brilliantly designed presentation. Excellent. So yes, hello, my name is Bérengère, and today I'm going to tell you about autism and bilingualism, two words that you rarely see together normally. So, is it working? Do I do this? Yes. So quickly, what we're going to talk about today. So a quick overview of the current situation on autism, bilingualism, autism and bilingualism. And then we'll focus on a particular mental process called social cognition and perspective taking, especially in the context of autism and bilingualism. And then we will actually talk about what I did during my PhD. This is a teaser. I will see first who autistic bilingual are, and then we will talk about how bilingualism influences social life satisfaction, mental skills, and brain networks. And finally, we will discuss what this all means, particularly in real life. So, autism. So autism is a complex developmental condition that is characterized by three main features: difficulties in social communication and social interactions, repetitive behaviors, and sensory processing. So difficulties in sensory processing, it is basically autistic people very often have oversensitivity or undersensitivity to things, like oversensitivity to sounds is when they perceive normal level of sounds as being particularly loud and stressful. And social communication difficulties is something that I'm going to insist upon now, because this is what I'm using for the rest of my research. And yes, autistic people can have great difficulties understanding social information and social interactions and how people communicate socially, all the also non-verbal cues, all the social rules, all of that. And actually there are loads of therapies that include teaching autistic children and autistic people how to learn explicitly social communication. So autism is a developmental condition. It means that it begins in utero. It does not begin after a vaccine. And I really want this to be clear for everybody. Autism is not caused by vaccines at all. So autism begins as the brain starts to develop. It's a very complex mechanism, the way autism impacts brain development, but basically as the brain starts to wire itself, it just works slightly differently in an autistic brain. Autism can happen with various degrees of intensity and at all levels of cognitive abilities. Autism is a lifelong condition. It means that even though when we think about autism, usually we think about an autistic child, but you know, actually autistic children do not suddenly stop being autistic when they turn 18. They go on to become autistic adults and autistic old people as well. And finally, the experience of autism and the experience of autistic people is greatly influenced by the context. So something that they will find particularly challenging in a particular environment, they might not find that challenging in a different context. It will not mean that they're not autistic anymore. It just means that they are in a context that is appropriate for the way that they work. And this is a slide from my supervisor, Sue Fletcher-Watson. All of these people are autistic people, and as you can see, none of them are, you know, the white boy aged about 10 that we usually think about when we think about autism. Autism can happen in any gender, any culture, any ethnicity, at any age. Now, bilingualism. So it is estimated that at least half the world's population is bilingual or lives in a bilingual environment. And bilingualism, like all of the things that we do and learn, it impacts our mind and our functions. So the way we deal with loads of information, and also in terms of social cognition. And we'll talk about social cognition again a bit later. And it also impacts the brain in terms of neuroanatomy, so the way everything is wired, and in terms of neuroactivity, so in the way that the brain networks actually work. And bilingualism, it is not a binary thing, so it's not you're totally monolingual versus you're totally bilingual. It's actually a continuum. And the experience of bilingualism is characterized by many different features of the bilingual experience, like the number of languages that you know, the age of acquisition for each of these languages, your proficiency in these languages, the exposure to these languages, and also the switching that you do between these languages. So for example, for me, in terms of like the brain and the mind consequences of bilingualism, actually, all of these different types of being bilingual have slightly different ways of impacting the mind and the brain. So in my case, for example, in terms of switching, for example, I'm in Scotland and I never use French. So my French and English never meet, and I really rarely switch between them. I just use English all the time, and I use French only when I text my friends at home. If I were to live in Montreal, as exactly the same person, same age of acquisition, same proficiency, I would be using French and English all the time, and they would constantly switch with each other. And in terms of brain and cognitive effects of bilingualism, these would be very different. So wait a second. So I've been talking about bilingualism. And so as I said, we know that bilingualism stimulates and changes the mind and the brain in neurotypical people, non-autistic people, and that generally bilingualism is good. But in autism, we don't actually know. And because we don't know, this leads to loads of worries and doubts for parents, bilingual parents of autistic children, and for their practitioners. They're worried that the child will be confused if the child is raised bilingually. They're worried that bilingualism is a burden, that bilingualism will cause language delays. And there are also some other concerns that are more practical. So for example, all the therapies that the autistic child would have to attend will be given in the majority language. So for example, in Scotland, that would be English. So it makes sense to reinforce English and just put aside any second language. And also they always then go back to, there's no research available to actually know what it does to be bilingual when you're autistic as well. And it's true, there's very little research available, but there's a little bit. Most of them actually are with parents or practitioners and focus on their experiences. But they're not actually autistic people themselves. Most of the studies are actually with autistic bilingual children, and they focus on language development, autism symptoms, or a few of them, overall mental skills and social functioning. And there's like, when I started my PhD, I think it was about 3 studies that were with autistic bilingual adults, and actually all of them were on polyglot savants, so autistic people who have learned like 10, 15 languages and can speak them perfectly fluently. But I strongly doubt that all autistic bilingual people are either children born in bilingual families or highly proficient polyglot savants, because after all, in the non-autistic population, that is not the situation. So now looking at these studies that measured language and mental skills. So all of them were done with children. There are actually fewer than 15 studies in total for now. And the studies looking at language development showed little to no delay, which is very unsurprising actually, because in non-autistic children, sometimes bilingualism can cause a bit of delay for the language development. Bilingual children eventually catch up with their peers. And we basically see exactly the same thing with autistic children. And for the few studies that looked at overall mental skills, they showed no delay at all. But that still leaves us with quite a bit of research that is absolutely not available. Like, for example, for children, any life information, so their experiences. There are actually now 2 papers on this that have a tiny sample, but still 2 papers. There's no information on their brain, and there's no information on specific mental skills. And in terms of adults, well, there is pretty much nothing outside of highly proficient polyglots. So that's what I decided to do. So I decided to do that, but focusing on a particular mental process called social cognition. Social cognition is basically all of the things we use when we interact with other people online or in real life. So as you can imagine, we use this daily, and it impacts our social life quality. The development of social cognition in childhood is stimulated by our social interactions, obviously, and also by language inputs. And as I said, social cognition, it's basically a bundle of process, and it includes many different things like perspective taking, which is what I focused on for my research. Perspective taking, what is it? Well, it's basically when you take the perspective of somebody else. It's pretty straightforward. There are different types of perspective taking processes, like cognitive perspective taking. It is about understanding what the other person thinks. And affective perspective taking is about understanding what the other person feels. And there are different levels of difficulties, obviously, like for many different cognitive processes. So, bilingualism and perspective taking. Well, in non-autistic children, we always find a positive influence, meaning that bilingual children are better at perspective taking than monolingual children. In adults, though, well, some studies find that yes, some studies no, some studies find no conclusive result. But importantly, all of these studies, they saw bilingualism as a binary thing. And as I said at the beginning, it's not binary at all. There are many different types of bilingual experience. And all of these studies used very different criteria to select their bilinguals and monolinguals. So they were not actually comparable, and they were all measuring different types of perspective-taking processes. So it was hard to actually compare them. And in autism, well, obviously nothing, like no idea at all what is going on. So that's what I decided to research. I wanted to see how bilingualism impacted social cognition every step of the way, from social habits to mental processes to brain networks supporting these mental processes. So the first step, I did that with an online questionnaire for autistic, monolingual and bilingual adults, basically for everybody. And with this questionnaire, I first wanted to know who were autistic bilingual people, because in the mind of many academics, they cannot exist, yet they do. So I thought that maybe I should ask them who they were. And second, I also wanted to see if, according to them, being bilingual had influenced their social life. So I got 299 responses, which is about 290 more than I was expecting. 89 monolinguals, 99 bilinguals, and 110 multilinguals. And the main result here, it's diversity. There was such a huge diversity of language profiles. So here you can see the age of acquisition and proficiency in the first, second, and third languages, and each red dot is a person. As you can see, they can learn their second language and third languages from birth all the way to adulthood. They can be highly proficient in several languages, or just not very proficient, like me and my Spanish right now. And this is also, so again, the age of acquisition, but in group and the environment where they learn their languages. So yes, many of them learn their second and third languages at home with their family. So it's basically the ones that are studied in all the studies that I've mentioned at the beginning. But many of them only learn their second or third languages at school or in the community, or maybe some of them actually just independently because they wanted to. And all of these people are absolutely not represented in the research at the moment. And then did they felt like bilingualism had shaped their social life? Yes. And in the analysis that I did, I found that actually it was the number of languages that they know that was influencing the social life quality rating. So the multilinguals were more satisfied than the bilinguals, who were more satisfied than the monolinguals. So now that I had this result, I could go to the mental abilities. So I conducted a cognitive assessment of neurotypical and autistic adults. So as I said at the beginning, we sort of know that bilingualism influences perspective taking in neurotypical people. However, as I said, bilingualism, it is many different things, and perspective taking, it is many different things as well. So what exactly is going on in neurotypical people first, because even then we don't really know what is happening, and in autistic people. So to answer this question, I used loads of measures to first measure all the different aspects of the bilingual experience in all of my participants, so gathering data on the age of acquisition of their languages, their proficiency, their switching experience, all of that. And I also measured general mental abilities like executive function, so inhibition, switching, as well as nonverbal intelligence as control measures. And I measured different types of perspective taking, but I will only be talking about these two, cognitive and affective perspective taking. So for that, I used a task with loads of videos of social interactions, and each video was followed by 5 questions focusing on different types of perspective taking. So for example, for affective perspective taking, the question was, what does John think Claire feels when this happens in the video? And there were also control videos where questions were not about the social interaction. And then with that, I built a lot of models. And for anyone who has ever had to build models, they will empathize with this map drawn by Wilhelmina, where students leave the village of clueless PhD students, try and find the glory of correct modeling, but actually no path gets us there. And this just all makes me very, very sad and reminds me of the darkest hours of my PhD. But then to answer my question, I recruited 96 bilingual neurotypical adults. So this is just some basic information about their demographics. They were all quite intelligent, quite above average in terms of intelligence and in terms of education. So it might not apply to everybody, but still. And this is some basic information about their language experiences. So as you can see, quite a lot of diversity in terms of the ages of acquisition and proficiency in this sample. So the result of my modeling for this sample, this was the result. I found that yes, bilingualism did influence perspective taking abilities, but the predictor for that was actually the age of acquisition of the second language. I'm above and beyond the effect of general mental skills and executive functions and intelligence. And so basically we had an effect showing that people who had learned their second language earlier were better at doing perspective taking in adulthood. And that was amazing because in my sample, actually, I've probably not noticed, but all my participants had learned their second language before age 15. So I was pretty sure that it would be not enough diversity to actually find any effect of that. So I was amazed of finding an effect of the age of acquisition of L2. But there was very low viability in my sample for this particular variable, and yet I found an effect. So I guess it must be quite a strong effect. So basically, yes, early bilingualism stimulates the development of perspective taking, and this fits with the result that we find in the studies with children. Now, what about autism? Do we find exactly the same relationship in autism as in neurotypical people or not? Because as I said, the autistic brain works slightly differently. So maybe it is not sensitive to the bilingual effect in the same way. Or maybe it's not sensitive at all to the bilingualism effect. So I recruited 39 autistic people, which is not enough for the wonderful world of statistics, but which is absolutely amazing when you do research in such an under-researched field. So I'm so grateful for every single one of them. Again, this is a table for their demographics. They're all quite high in terms of intelligence and in terms of education. So again, this finding might not reflect what is going on for people with more average or low average intelligence. So again, this is some information about their language profiles. Again, a lot of diversity, except again for the age of acquisition of L2, but I remained optimistic. So what did I find with my many models? The exact same thing. Again, as for the neurotypical group, I found an effect of the age of acquisition of the second language only above and beyond any effect of other mental skills or general intelligence. And again, I found that in spite of the low variability of the sample on this particular predictor. Again, all the participants had learned their second language before age 15. So the conclusion: bilingualism stimulates the development of perspective taking in autism as it does in typical development. So now we can move on to actually the neural basis of this effect, because it's great that I found an effect of early bilingualism on perspective taking at the behavioral and cognitive level. But can we find actually neural basis for this effect? So that's what I tried to do by calling back some of my participants to put them in an MRI, and my participants were very generous, so they agreed. It's true that these are quite small sample size, so going from 7 to 9 per group, but that's fMRI studies for that type of research. You don't get much better than that. This time I split them into groups with early bilinguals versus late bilinguals. And well, it's too quick for you to look at all the details in this table, but basically they were comparable in all other demographic and language variables, except that some of them were autistic, others were neurotypical, and some had acquired their second language early, so before age 5, or late after age 5. And they did a task in the MRI scanner that was again a perspective taking task. They saw some stories with 3 pictures, and then they had to choose the appropriate ending to the picture based on the understanding of the emotions or the mental states of the characters. And I found in a teeny tiny brain region called the right anterior cingulate gyrus that the activity in this tiny region during cognitive perspective taking was actually influenced by bilingualism, that late bilinguals were activating this region a lot while early bilinguals were not activating it, which suggests that actually late bilinguals, for the exact same result, had to use it a lot. And this bilingual effect was not changed at all by autism. So this could mean that early bilingualism stimulates a higher processing efficiency in this region for cognitive perspective taking in autistic and neurotypical people alike. So the conclusion for all of these studies, first, there is a huge diversity of language profiles in autism that are currently not at all acknowledged in the literature. And the number of languages that an autistic person has influenced their social life quality. Then there is a developmental effect of bilingualism on perspective taking, meaning that the effect of bilingualism occurs when the brain and mental skills develop, at least in terms of perspective taking, and that it is exactly the same relationship between perspective taking and bilingualism, both in typical development and in autism. And finally, as in the cognitive level, early bilingualism influences the way the brain processes perspective taking, in particular cognitive perspective taking. And again, it is exactly the same influence of bilingualism in both a neurotypical brain and an autistic brain. So what does this all mean? Well, first, that there are many ways for autistic people to be bilingual, and that most of them are not acknowledged either in research or in clinical literature or in media or anywhere really. They are just not showed. Also, bilingualism is not a burden, apparently, for autistic people. Currently, no study finds that bilingualism is a dramatic burden for autistic people. And finally, early bilingualism seems to help with the development of some specific skills, both in neurotypical development and in autism. And particularly, it helps with skills that autistic people tend to struggle with. So it does not mean that I recommend that all autistic people should be forced to learn several languages from birth. No, it just means that parents of autistic children should not worry about using their mother tongue with their child, because, as I forgot to mention at the beginning, but because of the guidelines and because of what practitioners tell parents, very often bilingual parents just stop using their mother tongue with their child, just use the majority language, even if they are not confident using this language. It means that the child receives low quality input in the language that they hear. And actually there are precedents of parents who just barely speak to their child because they are so worried of not using bilingualism, but also not teaching wrong language with their child. And it cannot be good. So the bottom line here is that bilingualism will not be bad for the child, and parents can feel free to use their own language with their child. And then it's also important to consider all of that in real life. So as I said, real life for parents with their children, but also real life for autistic people themselves. Because, as I said, all these children who grow up in bilingual families who are just excluded from bilingualism tend to feel particularly isolated in their families. Well, actually, bilingualism can bring them closer to their communities by knowing the languages of their family and their communities. In my first study, the one where I tried to understand who autistic bilingual were, I also asked them to tell me about their experience. What was it like for them to be both autistic and bilingual? They spontaneously talked about all of the skills that they learned by learning a language. Like it has increased their self-confidence. They had learned how to identify and express thoughts and emotions. And bilingualism had helped them to better understand themselves and others. They also talked about all of the opportunities brought by languages. So bilingualism, it's also access to education, travel and job opportunities. It's also access to sources of knowledge and information. And particularly in the context of autism, several of them said that because they knew other languages, they were able to communicate with other autistic people from all around the world. And it had given them a feeling of being part of the autistic community. So bottom line is that we know bilingualism can open up the world for someone, and it is also true if this someone is autistic. So here, I just want to conclude by saying that bilingualism, it's okay for everybody, really. Thank you for listening to me, and special thanks to Maureen for inviting me today, my supervisors, Sue Fletcher-Woodson, Andrew Stanfield, and Antonella Sorace for their guidance, my participants, because without them, I would have absolutely no result at all. And finally, my friends who've endured all my PhD mental breakdowns over the last 3.5 years. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bérengère. It was really nice. It's our third neuroscience talk. They've been so different and so interesting, and this was really great. Learned a lot. First,
should I just stop the slide share?
You
maybe
can do whatever you want. It's fine. It's okay.
Stop it. Yes.
So, guys, remember, if you have questions, you should post them now before we finish. But I'll start. So, in your questionnaire at the very beginning, you had quite a lot of multilingual, like it was a third of your sample. Is that because you targeted the questionnaire, or it just happened?
I don't know. So, I mean, I advertised it. It was autism and bilingualism census. So obviously it would get a lot of bilingual and multilingual people. But I was saying really everywhere, like, it's fine. If you're not bilingual, it's fine. So of course, I think that a third of the autistic population is multilingual. That would not be realistic. But it does show that there are probably more than what you would think. Because I had almost as many as just bilinguals. So probably that if someone can be bilingual, they can be trilingual, and there's not that much stopping them from reaching that point. I think the data for this group was particularly interesting because I could learn so much more about their experience and the different environments where they can learn a language, and all of these things.
So you were saying that the life quality of multilingual was above average and above those of bilingual and above monolingual. But what were your criteria for this life quality assessment?
So for that, I used it was self-rated on different different statements that they had to agree or disagree with, and that were basically tackling overall social life satisfaction. So I was reluctant to use things that would be a good social life based on neurotypical standards, because what is a good social life for thing as a good social life for you? So it was pretty much loads of statements for them to rate if they were happy with the way that this particular thing was going on for them. And then for the analysis that led me to this result, again, I did modeling again, trying to see is any predictor of bilingualism influencing this. Because what I didn't discuss here in the result, obviously there was the effect of age. So younger people were happier than older people. That is something observed very often in autistic populations. So the effect of the number of languages, it was also not like exponential forever. So if you know 5 languages, you will be amazingly happy. It was just by groups. It was a group analysis for that one.
Okay, so we have a first question from Anne. You can see it, but I'm just going to read it so that the other participants not see it. So most autistic people of your sample have an IQ significantly higher than the average. Is that related with plurilingualism? Did you compare it? Well, maybe let's do one at a time. So is that related to plurilingualism?
I don't know, and I didn't check. It is possible that people with average to higher IQ are more prone to then becoming plurilingual, like multilingual or bilingual at least, and that people with lower IQ would not get there. But in a neurotypical population, that's not what is observed. Actually, it would be something so interesting to look at in autism, but in your neurotypical non-autistic population, we see people with lower IQ managing several languages. And actually in autism, the few cases that I can think about, it's cases of autistic people with that you would call before with the former diagnosis criteria, low functioning. So they could not take care of themselves. So you would say very low intelligence. And yet they knew like 10 languages. So it can happen. Then were they intelligent because of bilingualism, or were they bilingual because of their intelligence? It's still hard to like pinpoint.
Okay. The rest of the question was actually it was not another question, it was the rest of that question, but you already answered, I believe. And she just like thank you for an autistic French one.
Thank you.
So I don't know if that's a myth or what. Don't mean to offend anyone, but there is this perception that autistic people have improved memory and like are a bit more. So I know a few examples of people that I've met with how like amazing abilities in remembering, like, was it like scientific names. So I had like an autistic student that was like literally he knew every scientific name of every insect. It was quite crazy to see. And there is this that actually autistic people have heightened ability in terms of memory. Is that a myth, or is that, what's that?
So no, it is true, but not for all of them. So not everybody has a, like, not all autistic people have a like autistic talent. Like, you know, the one being good at math. And I remember that tweet about like, it was an autistic girl, I think, saying like, when I see all of these people in like in the movies and everything, all of these autistic people are so good at math, I feel like such a fraud for my community because I'm autistic and I'm not good at math. And I apologize to everybody. And so it's true, like, it's true. Their mind works differently. It is true. And it can often reflect by just a very good ability to memorize things that they're passionate about. Like, anyone can learn more easily things that they're interested in. They just do it better. Or seeing patterns, and that is in terms of the way the autistic mind works, better at seeing patterns. And actually, it can be very useful for language learning. So for loads of participants said actually for them, learning languages was so easy, much easier than for many neurotypical people, because from the language that they knew, they could understand how the new language was working, and they could learn all the grammar, all the rules so much faster than a neurotypical person. So actually, good memory, pattern findings, all of that can just put them very much like ahead of a neurotypical student when learning a language.
Yeah, it was quite funny with that kid. So it stayed with us for a few months, and I remember that day we were supposed to have a collective training and just ran into the room and felt like there were too many people there, so it just came back. It's like, can I stay with you? And he found out I was from Martinique, and he was like, oh, so do you have this bug in Martinique, and this one, and this one, and this one? And it literally like lasted 3 hours. For 3 hours he had names coming, and I was like, no, I don't even know what that is. No. And he kept going. He's incredible. Yeah, I don't even know how this is possible. Okay.
Yeah, I mean,
yeah, it's
just very good at memory.
So if you have additional questions, now is the time. If you're writing, just raise your hand so I don't hang up on you.
I've bombarded them with information. That's why.
No, it was really nice. No, I think no one has questions. So thank you so much, Bérengère. It was really sweet, really nice to see you. Yeah, it was amazing talk. So I remind you, everyone, that the talks are uploaded on YouTube, unless Bérengère says no, but I guess it's fine. Yeah, so maybe not immediately, but 2-3 weeks you should be able to find it on our channel. Thank you, everyone, for attending, and I guess I'll see you next week. Thank you, Bérengère.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.